welcome back to Feasting on the Word. I am DG Hamblin, and today I'm revisiting a topic from a few weeks ago, the meaning of the word Mormon. I already did a short video on this, but I found more details to add, so don't go away, have a listen, and then tell me what you think in the comments below. But first, I want to remind you of the 34th International Book of Mormon Evidence Conference being held in Eagle Mountain, Utah on October 24th through the 26th. Rod Meldrum, the Book of Mormon evidence guy, will be there, of course, along with a whole host of other scholars and speakers, the least of which is yours truly. I will be speaking. There will be more than 120 topics addressed across the 3 days, and I'm going to be speaking on Friday and Saturday. You can go to bookofmormonevidence.org for a schedule of speakers and to buy tickets in advance at a discount. And I hope to see you there. Now, for the subject at hand. There's a road and a community close to my home here in Northeast Georgia, which is named after a prominent hill in that area with a peculiar name. It is called Booger Hill. Naturally, it's a source of amusement for anyone who's not from our area, but there's also a story about how this place became known as Booger Hill. You see, back in the day, before farmers traveled back and forth by pickup truck, horses were the primary means of travel, and those horses would often get spooked as they traveled the road which wound its way up and over this hill. Well, since there was no visible sign of anything which should make a horse nervous, the local residents would say that the hill was inhabited by a booger, or an evil spirit, which the animals would sense and then become scared. Yes, a booger at that time meant a type of ghost or a mythical spirit creature and had nothing to do with your nose. What you might ask now is, what does this have to do with the Book of Mormon? Well, maybe not much. I'm just demonstrating how some places get their names. Places such as the land of Mormon. In Mosiah 18, Alma has been converted and is going about privately teaching the people about the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now he has to be careful because his conversion has already made King Noah angry, and the conversion of others would only anger the king further. He needs a place where those who believe his teachings can gather to be baptized and to receive their temple rights. That's a whole other video. Anyway, they needed a place which was uninhabited. And Mosiah 18:4 tells us that as many as did believe him did go forth to a place which was called Mormon. We then read that the place was named by the king, and the reason for the king giving it that particular name. That's because it was, quote, in the borders of the land, having been infested by times or at seasons by wild beasts, end quote. When I realized that this was the reason the king gave this land its name, I suddenly thought that perhaps I could discover the meaning of the name Mormon if I could find an ancient word in biblical Hebrew which was pronounced in a manner similar to Mormon. And while I did not find an individual word which answered the question, I did find what I believe to be the answer and the meaning of this word used by the king in naming the land. Let me first say that I am not a Hebrew scholar. I do not claim to know more than those who are well versed in that language, but I am a pretty good investigator, and I have a mind which is made for problem solving and finding connections which others might miss. And I love solving problems and finding connections. So the first thing I did was make a list of the words which might be connected to the meaning of Mormon. I decided to look at borders, land, infested, times, seasons, and wild beasts. And once I had my list, I searched for those words in the Old Testament using one of my favorite apps, which I won't name. This allowed me to see the original Hebrew word with pronunciation, definitions, and the English words in the Old Testament, which are translated from the original Hebrew. With the words borders, land, infest, and wild beasts, I didn't really find anything which reminded me of Mormon. However, when I looked at the words times and seasons, I found what I felt was a possible connection. There are 472 instances of the word time or times in the Old Testament of the King James Bible, and season or seasons is found in only 39 instances. Now, each of these English words is translated from a number of Hebrew words, and each of those Hebrew words has multiple meanings in English depending upon the context. Of all the Hebrew words I looked at, I found 4 which can be translated as either times or seasons. And in their English transliterated form, they are Eth, Yom, Moed, and Zaman. Now, did those last 2 catch your attention? I hope so. You see, Hebrew makes extensive use of compound words, and by combining Moed and Zaman, the first step toward a reasonable meaning of Mormon is taken. When combining the phonetic sound of the first syllable of Moed and the phonetic sound of the second syllable of Zaman, one could reasonably come up with Momon as a word meaning times or seasons, referring to what appears to be the migratory patterns of the wild beasts. Now, this could be close enough to allow the construction of the word to end there, even without the R sound. However, the Hebrew letter Resh, which is the closest to R in English, adds additional meaning to the word Mormon. Hebrew is a complex language with lots of nuance in the meanings of numbers, words, and even letters. Every letter means something on its own, and the Hebrew Resh is no different. The letter Resh can be traced all the way back to the Proto-Semitic language from which Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, Phoenician, and Syriac all evolved. In Hebrew, the Resh can represent several things, some of them contradictory. It can mean head, which the original Resh was drawn to depict. It can also mean wickedness, righteousness, or a return to righteousness from wickedness. And in that sense, it can also mean a going back and forth, as in the shaking of a head. Using R or Resh as an infix between the syllables makes sense. What is rendered is a word which refers to the migrating movements of the wild beasts which infested the land. But let's not just stop there. We can also show how the word Mormon has a connection to the Heartland model of Book of Mormon geography. Wikipedia's list of mammals that perform mass migrations, and yes, that is a subject, list of mammals that perform mass migrations, names 5 quadrupeds native to North America and none in Central or South America. These are bison, elk, mule deer, pronghorn, and reindeer. And of these animals, the bison were by far the most aggressive, the most numerous, and far-ranging. They roamed in herds which varied in size from a few dozen in the southeastern area of what is now the United States to the thousands across the Great Plains. If the wild beasts of Mosiah are bison, it's easy to understand why Joseph Smith chose to use the word infested when describing their temporary residence in an area. The 1828 edition of Webster's Dictionary defines infest as to trouble greatly, to disturb, to annoy, to harass. And bison would have completely destroyed any crops growing and may have even attacked people living in the area. I have a neighbor who has been raising bison for more than 40 years. Even today, even though he's been raising them for decades, and even though they have had far more human contact than bison, which would have lived in the wild, would have, they still use very strict cautionary measures when they are around the bison herd. For example, I watched two of the workers repairing a section of fence around a pasture which contained bison. Really, there was only one person repairing the fence. He worked on the fence with a pickup truck parked directly behind him with the doors open. The other worker stood on the other side of the truck watching the herd. They had no way of knowing if or when the bison would suddenly become aggressive and charge them. If the herd became the least bit restless or wandered too close, the one keeping watch would warn the other, and they would both get in the truck where it was relatively safe. And I say relatively safe because bison have no reservation about attacking a vehicle. So, with an infestation at regular intervals, it's understandable why Alma and his followers gathered there for private meetings. There would have been nobody living in the land of Mormon. Now, other than speculation that these wild beasts were bison, is there any evidence which points toward bison living in the promised land? Yes, there is. In 1 Nephi 18:23, verse 23, Nephi writes about the arrival of the families of Lehi and Ishmael, saying that we did arrive at the promised land, and we went forth upon the land, and did pitch our tents, and we did call it the promised land. He then gives a brief summary of their agriculture and lists the animals they saw. In verse 25, he says, there were beasts in the forest of every kind, both the cow and the ox, and the ass and the horse, and the goat and the wild goat, and all manner of wild animals, which were for the use of men. Now, it is the meaning of the word ox which is of particular interest. The 1828 edition of Webster's Dictionary gives an interesting definition of the word ox. In regard to domestic animals, an ox is always a castrated male bovine. But regarding wild animals, the definition of ox changes and would indicate both males and sometimes females. Since wild animals would not be castrated, it's assumed that the male specimens would be intact. And with this in mind, let us then look at the meaning of the word bison and the history of this particular animal. The origin of the English word bison is Greek and means wild ox in the Greek language. Additionally, in Doctor in Linguas, I know I probably didn't say that right. Oh well. Doctor in Linguas, the 1617 lexicon by John Minshew, defines bison as a wild ox, great-eyed, broad-faced, that will never be tamed. In addition, it's possible that Lehi and Nephi would have been familiar with a near relative of the bison of North America. The European bison and steppe bison once roamed most of Europe and Asia. The European bison, which are still extant, are known to have once lived at least as far as the Caucasus region and possibly further, where they cohabitated with the steppe bison. Although the steppe bison are now extinct, Some remains have been found which date to as recently as 1060 BC. Therefore, it is possible that some specimens were still alive a few centuries later. Also, Isaiah seems to have been familiar with bison. In Isaiah 34:7, he speaks of the re'em, a Hebrew word, also found in Deuteronomy, Numbers, and Job, which, although translated unicorn in the King James Bible, is believed to refer to a wild bull or auroch. The auroch was the predecessor to the bison and extinct by the time of Isaiah. Therefore, it seems reasonable that Isaiah may have been referring to the bison. Now, although it's impossible to know definitively whether or not Lehi and his family were familiar with bison, it seems probable. Combined with the defining of bison as wild ox, it seems likely that the animals named in 1 Nephi as, quote, the ox, were the animals we know today as bison, and that Lehi and his sons would have referred to them in their language by a term meaning wild ox. Now, could I be wrong in all this? Certainly. But I believe that there's enough evidence for us to infer that the most likely meaning of Mormon is something similar to times and seasons, and that the wild beasts mentioned were bison. By the way, do you believe that Joseph Smith knew the meaning of Mormon as used by Alma? Well, I do. And if he did, does that shed light on the name of the newspaper, Times and Seasons, published in the early days of the restored church? Perhaps Joseph Smith was having fun with the nickname given to the church by its enemies, Mormons. And he came up with a modern Hebraism or play on words. Well, thank you for listening to me ramble for a few minutes. I hope to see you again soon, and I hope to see you on October 24th through the 26th in Eagle Mountain, Utah at the Book of Mormon Evidence Conference. Until then, keep feasting on the Word.